They gave me the job of keeping the record because I was young, because I was thorough, and because, as senior archivist Vel Orth put it, I had no opinions yet worth protecting. That was the phrase he used. No opinions worth protecting. I wrote it down in my personal log that evening, which tells you something about how I felt about it, even then. My name is Darrell Haas. I was 26 years old when the Joint Treaty Commission convened its 47th extraordinary session, and I was assigned as the junior record keeper for the human delegation hearings. That means I sat at the long table to the left of the chamber floor, below the tiered seats, with a transcription slate and a seal stamp, and a copper badge that got me through every checkpoint in the building. It also means I was in the room for every session. I saw what happened. I wrote down what was said and what was not said. I watched them also what I had written, and I have spent 30 years deciding what to do about it. This is what happened. The Joint Treaty Commission drew its membership from 11 species. It had existed for 80 years in one form or another. Born from an armistice, grown into a bureaucracy, calcified into an institution that believed its own paperwork. Its chambers were a long hall of pale stone and dark wood, tiered seating along 3 walls, and a central floor where delegations stood to address the body. The ceiling was vaulted glass, crossed by iron beams, and on clear days the light came down in columns and hit the floor in a way that made the whole room feel like a cathedral. On cloudy days it felt like a waiting room. The humans had been a member of the commission for 14 years, when the 47th session was called. They were not a founding member. They had applied twice before being admitted, and both prior applications had been deferred. A word the commission used when it meant rejected but wanted to avoid the paperwork that came with a formal rejection. Their admission on the 3rd attempt had been contested, and the record reflects, in diplomatic language, several member species had expressed reservations. The record does not reflect, because I had not been hired yet, what those reservations actually were. But I learned them eventually. The reservations were that humans were too young a civilization to be full commission members, that their communication systems were too open, too undisciplined, too given to broadcasting outward without filter or protocol, and that their diplomatic style was, the word most commonly used, in the hall and in the antechambers, irregular. That was the polite construction. What they meant was that humans did not behave the way power was supposed to behave. They arrived at the table without the expected performance of deference. They did not adjust their arguments to accommodate the emotional states of senior delegations. They answered questions directly, was considered a kind of aggression in chambers, where questions were usually understood to be requests for a carefully negotiated non-answer. They brought documents when documents had not been requested. They placed those documents on the table without comment and waited. Several delegations had found this unnerving. 14 years of membership had not softened these habits. By the time I joined the commission staff, the human delegation had developed a particular reputation. They had participated in 63 treaty negotiations, serving on the drafting committee for 11 of them, and had dissented formally from the ratified text in 4. The dissents were on record. They were also, as I was quietly told by Vel Orth on my first week, a source of ongoing institutional embarrassment, because 2 of the 4 had subsequently been proven correct, meaning the ratified text had failed in exactly the ways the human dissent had predicted, and the commission had spent considerable diplomatic energy pretending this had not occurred. I was told to note the human delegation submissions with care because they had a tendency to be more specific than submissions were supposed to be. I remember thinking that sounded like a compliment dressed as a warning. I was right. The specificity had a particular character, where other delegations submitted position papers structured around principle, broad statements of interest, philosophical framings, appeals to shared values that could be agreed upon, without committing anyone to anything concrete. The human submissions read like engineering reports. They had citations. They had source lists that ran to multiple pages. They had, on several occasions, appendices that the Commission's review committees had not known how to classify because Nothing in the standard documentation framework had a category for them. One submission, filed 2 years before my arrival in connection with a trade route dispute, had included a demographic analysis of the affected species population's distribution that the Commission's own demographic advisory panel had been unable to replicate for 8 months, and which, when they finally did, matched the human figures within a fraction of a percent. Nobody had asked for the demographic analysis. The humans had included it because it was relevant to the argument they were making, and they had apparently not considered whether the Commission wanted to know relevant things or merely wanted to be agreed with. This was the crux of it, I came to understand. The Commission had been built by species who understood diplomacy as a performance of alignment. You came to the table. You each made statements of principle that acknowledged the other party's interests. You found a resolution that everyone could call a success, and you went home. The documentation was the performance's script. It was not meant to be interrogated. It was meant to be completed. The human delegation submitted documentation the way a person submits evidence. It was meticulous because they expected it to be examined. It was sourced because they expected the sources to be checked. It was specific because vagueness, in their apparent view, was not diplomacy but delay, and they had, from everything I could observe, a deep structural impatience with delay. Several senior delegates found this offensive. One had described it, in a remark that had made its way around the administrative staff's corridors, as the behavior of a species that doesn't trust the room. He had meant it critically. I had even then filed it away as an observation that told you more about the room than about the species. The 7th session was called officially to resolve a boundary dispute in the outer reaches of the Veth corridor. 3 species claimed overlapping survey rights to a cluster of uninhabited systems, and the dispute had been grinding through commission committees for 6 years without resolution. What had elevated it from a standard boundary disagreement to an extraordinary session was the discovery, 2 months prior, that the systems in question were not entirely uninhabited. A deep-range survey vessel had returned with evidence of subsurface structures on the 4th moon of a gas giant in the cluster, structures that predated any of the 3 claiming species survey records by several thousand years. That changed the nature of the claim. Whoever could establish a prior rights argument under Commission law would take the corridor. The Commission's prior rights framework was complex, but the short version was this. If you could demonstrate sustained contact with a location before any other member species, the claim was yours. 3 claimant species, the Vorath Conclave, the Salathi Hegemony, and the Keth Mercantile Assembly, had each filed prior rights briefs. The human delegation had also filed a brief. No one had expected the human brief. The Commission's Preliminary Review Committee, of which I was not a member, whose conclusions I transcribed, had noted the human submission with what I can only describe as reluctant interest. Brief was longer than the others. It was heavily sourced. It cited 11 independent survey records, 3 of which were from non-commission vessels that the committee had not previously known existed. It included a cartographic analysis prepared by an institution the committee could not immediately identify, and a section on the subsurface structures that the committee's own xenoarchaeology consultant later described, privately, as the most precise preliminary analysis he had seen in 40 years of work. The committee's official response was to table the human brief pending verification of sources. That was 6 weeks before the 47th session opened. By the time the session opened, 2 of the 11 cited survey records had been verified as authentic. The cartographic institution had been identified. It was a human university, archive that had been operating for over a century, and which had, it turned out, records of the Veth corridor systems going back 80 years, predating 3 of the 4 commission surveys on file. The xenoarchaeology consultant had submitted a supplemental note, also tabled, stating that his initial private assessment stood, and that the human brief's structural analysis was, in his professional opinion, correct. The committee had tabled all of this. I transcribed the tabling notices. The 47th session opened on a gray morning, with the vaulted ceiling letting in a flat, diffuse light that made everyone look tired. I was at my table, with my slate and my badge and a cup of cold tea that I had forgotten to drink. The three claimant delegations were at the floor. The Vorath in their formal gray robes, the Salathi in their layered silver, the Keth in their merchant house attire of dark red. The human delegation was at the far left of the floor, a single chair with a small table beside it, which was their assigned position, because they were a non-primary party in this dispute. They had been granted observation and submission rights, not full speaking rights. The human delegate's name was Senna Varro. She was, at the time, the Commission's senior human envoy, a woman in her late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and a record that, had any of the senior Commission members bothered to read it, should have prompted a different approach to the session entirely. She had negotiated 3 bilateral treaties, arbitrated 1 interspecies incident that had been on the edge of open conflict, and had once, according to a note in her file that I had read out of idle curiosity, been described by a Vorath trade minister as the only diplomat I have ever feared losing an argument to. What the file did not fully convey, and what I came to understand only by watching her in that chamber for 3 days, was the quality of her stillness. There is a kind of stillness that is passivity, a person waiting because they have nothing to do, and there is a kind of stillness that is concentration, a person waiting because they have decided that waiting is the most efficient available action and they are executing it precisely. Varro's stillness was the second kind. Every time I glanced at her during a procedural debate or a lengthy argument between claimant counsel, she was watching with the same level, unhurried attention, as if she were taking inventory, not of the words, but of what the words were covering. She sat down at the small table to the left. She had a leather satchel with her. She placed it on the floor beside her chair without opening it. She folded her hands on the table. She waited. Commission's chair Mero Soth called the session to order. Soth was a tall Vorath in his formal robes, whose career had been spent in the Commission's upper chambers, and who had the manner of a man who had learned, long ago, that authority was mostly a matter of projecting certainty. He read the session's purpose, the 3 primary parties, and noted briefly that the human delegation had been granted limited observation status. The word limited was not in the original session brief. I noticed it, wrote it down. The morning was spent on procedural matters. The 3 claimant delegations each presented abbreviated summaries of their prior arguments. The Vorath summary was long and well organized. The Salathi summary was confident and occasionally imprecise. The Keth summary was, in the understated language of my transcription notes, enthusiastic. Each delegation had counsel present. Each counsel objected to the other's submissions on procedural grounds at various points. I transcribed the objections. By midday I had filled 2 slates and drunk 3 cups of tea and learned nothing that was not already in the pre-session briefs. After the midday recess, Soth announced that the Commission would proceed to the review of the human submission in the interest of procedural completeness. That phrase, in the interest of procedural completeness, was a particular kind of diplomatic signal. It meant, we are doing this because we are required to, not because we expect it to matter. Senna Varro was invited to present. She stood. She did not pick up the satchel. She walked to the floor, stood in the presenting position and said, in the even and unhurried voice I would come to recognize as her default register. The human delegation's submission is in the record. We will not summarize it. We ask that the Commission treat it as submitted. Soth looked at her for a moment. Chair notes that the delegation has observation status only, he said, not primary party status. The submission has been reviewed and tabled pending source verification. We note that 2 sources have been verified, Varro said, and we note that the tabling notice did not specify a resolution timeline. The committee will address verification in due course. The submission stands, Varro said. She walked back to her chair. She sat down. She folded her hands again. There was a pause in the chamber that I would not have known how to describe at the time, but that I would later recognize, having seen several more of them in subsequent years, as the particular silence of a room that is recalibrating. Sith moved on. The afternoon session was devoted to a procedural debate about the status of the human submission. Specifically, whether a non-primary party's tabled submission could be entered into the active evidentiary record before verification was complete. The three primary parties each had opinions. The Vorath Council argued that tabled submissions should remain tabled, as the Commission's verification procedures existed precisely to prevent unverified material from influencing deliberations. The Salafi Council agreed. The Keth Council, whose primary argument depended on a survey record that was itself pending a minor verification query, argued with slightly less certainty. The human delegation said nothing during this debate. Senavaro sat at her small table and did not intervene. I noticed that she made no notes. She watched the chamber with the patient, the attention of someone who has seen a room talk itself into a corner before, and knows that the most efficient thing to do is wait. At the end of the afternoon session, Soth ruled that the human submission would remain tabled and that the Commission would proceed with deliberations on the basis of the three primary parties' submissions. He added, again in language that was not in the standard procedural template, that non-primary submissions which remained under verification review could not be permitted to introduce uncertainty into what he called the established evidentiary framework. I transcribed this. I also noted in my personal log that evening, the established evidentiary framework was the three primary parties' own submissions, and that the uncertainty being excluded was, so far as I could tell, the only part of the record that was independently verified. I was 26. I had no opinions worth protecting. I kept this to myself. The second day of the session was the day the record diverged from what happened. I did not know this at the time. I would not fully understand it for another 3 weeks. But looking back, with everything I know now, the second day is where the Commission made its decision and then spent the rest of the session building a documentation trail to support it. The morning of the second day, before the session formally opened, there was a closed meeting of the Commission's procedural committee. I was not in this meeting. It is not standard practice to minute closed procedural committee meetings. I know about it because one of the Keth delegation's junior aides told a junior Salafi aide in the building's lower corridor, and the building has very good acoustics in the lower corridor, and I happened to be walking that direction to retrieve a forgotten transcript seal. The procedural committee, as best I could reconstruct from what I overheard and what I subsequently inferred, had spent the night reviewing the verified elements of the human submission, and had concluded that the submission was, in the words used by one committee member, a problem. Specifically, if the human prior rights claim was valid, and the verified sources suggested it might be, then none of the three primary parties' claims held under Commission law, because the human archive records predated all of them. The corridor would go to humanity. This was not the outcome the session had been convened to produce. I want to be precise about what I am not saying. I am not saying that anyone in that committee meeting said, falsify the record. I am saying that after the meeting, the session's evidentiary log was updated to note that the human submission source verification had been suspended pending additional committee review, a status that did not previously exist in Commission procedure, and that the Commission's documentation office had apparently created the previous evening on short notice. I am saying that the updated log replaced my original transcription of the two verified sources, removing the verification notations. I am saying that when I asked Vel Orath about this that morning, he told me that the committee had authority to amend preliminary transcriptions and that I should update my working file to match the official log. I updated my working file. I kept the original in a separate location. The second day's open session proceeded on the basis that the human's submission remained fully tabled, no verified sources, no active status. Soth ran it efficiently. The three primary parties made their arguments. The chamber debated. By the end of the second afternoon, the session was moving toward a resolution framework that would divide the corridor among three claimant species, with the human submissions formally closed as unverified and withdrawn. It had not been withdrawn. I had not transcribed any withdrawal. When I checked the session log that evening, a withdrawal notice had been added, timestamped 2 hours before the afternoon session, with a notation that it had been submitted by the human delegation's courier. The human delegation had no courier. They traveled with two people, Senna Varro and a young aide named Cale Dern, who had, as far as I had observed, spent both days sitting very still and keeping his face professionally neutral. I sat with my original transcripts and my amended working file and a cup of tea that I again forgot to drink, and I thought about what a person with no opinions worth protecting was supposed to do with information like this. Third day was the last day of the session. The resolution framework was to be finalized, signed, and entered into the commission record by end of session. The corridor would be divided. The human submission would be closed. Senna Varro arrived at her small table with the leather satchel again. She placed it on the floor. She sat down. She folded her hands. Soth opened the session and moved immediately to the resolution framework. The Vorath and Salathi delegations signaled readiness to sign. The Keth delegation requested a minor amendment to the boundary coordinates, and after a brief argument about fractions of degrees, got half of what they wanted and signaled readiness to sign. Sath turned to the human delegation. The Joint Treaty Commission notes that the human delegation submission has been formally closed as unverified and withdrawn. The delegation is invited to acknowledge this notation for the record. Varro stood. She reached down and picked up the leather satchel. She placed it on her small table and opened it. She removed from it a flat document, folded once, sealed with a plain wax stamp. She walked to the floor. She placed the document on the floor table, the long table used for submitted materials, and pushed it to the center. She said, "The human delegation does not acknowledge the notation. We note that no withdrawal was filed by this delegation. We further note that the submission's verification status was altered on the morning of the second session day without notice to the submitting party, in contravention of Commission Procedural Code, Section 14, Paragraph 3. A copy of the original verification record, with timestamp, is enclosed. A second copy was transmitted to the Commission's independent oversight body at the close of the first session day." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "The delegation is prepared to allow the Commission time to reconcile its record before the resolution framework is finalized. We ask for a 48-hour recess. I want to be careful here about what I heard, because I have been asked about it many times, and I think the question people are really asking is, did she sound angry? Did she sound triumphant? Was there something in the tone that signaled what she knew? The answer is no. She sounded exactly as she had sounded on the first day, when she had said the submission stood, controlled even. She delivered the procedural violation citation, Section 14, Paragraph 3, with the same cadence she might have used to read out an address. The effect of this, I realized later, was more unsettling than anger would have been. Anger can be managed. Anger invites a response in kind. She offered was something the chamber had no framework for. A factual statement about what had been done, delivered without moral performance, followed by a specific and reasonable request. The 48-hour recess was not a trap. It was genuinely an offer. If the Commission had taken it, record could have been reconciled. The submission could have been reinstated. The session could have concluded differently. The chamber did not produce the silence I had seen on the first day. It produced something different, a denser, colder quiet, the kind that comes when a room understands that it has been caught and is deciding how to respond. Soth said, "The Commission's records are in order." Varro said, "Then the enclosed document will cause no difficulty." She walked back to her chair. She sat down. She folded her hands. Soth looked at the document on the floor table. The Vorath Council leaned to the Vorath senior delegate and said something I not hear but transcribed as inaudible. The Keth delegation's senior representative had turned in his chair and was conferring with his aide. Salathi senior delegate was looking at Varro with an expression that I could not quite categorize, not anger, exactly, and not fear. Something that was, perhaps, the face a person makes when they have just realized that the ground is different from what they thought. Sath called for a brief recess. I will tell you what I did during that recess because it matters. I walked out of the chamber with my transcription slate and my badge, and I went to the archivist's corridor on the lower level, where the Commission's document processing terminals were located. I pulled up the session record as it currently stood. I pulled up my personal backup of the original. I compared them side by side. There were 9 discrepancies. 2 were the verified source notations. 1 was the withdrawal notice. The other 6 were smaller, adjusted timestamps, a missing objection notation from the first afternoon, a rewording of Soth's procedural ruling that changed its meaning in a way that was subtle but significant. I made a full copy of both versions. I sealed it and noted it in my personal log. Then I went back to my table and sat down and waited. The recess lasted 40 minutes instead of the standard 15. When Soth reconvened the session, he announced that the commission had reviewed the human delegation's notation and that the procedural matter it raised would be referred to the documentation committee for assessment in the normal course. He announced that the resolution framework would proceed to signing as scheduled. Varro did not stand. She looked at Soth and said nothing. The resolution framework was signed. The corridor was divided. The session was closed. Senna Varro stood, picked up her satchel. The document she had placed on the floor table was still there. No one had picked it up, and walked out of the chamber without another word. Her aide followed her. The door at the back of the chamber closed. I sat at my transcription table with my slate and did not move for a long moment. I was aware that the chamber was beginning to clear, that the delegates and their counsel were gathering documents and moving toward the exits, that the session was, as far as the Joint Treaty Commission was concerned, over. I thought about the sealed copy in my satchel. I thought about what Senna Varro had said, a second copy transmitted to the independent oversight body at the close of the first session day. She had known by the end of the first day that the record would be altered. I was 26 years old, and I had been in this job for 4 months, and I had just watched an institution I had believed in decide that its convenience was worth more than its own law, and the delegation that had been wronged had walked out without raising its voice. I finished my transcription of the closing proceedings. I submitted it to the official record. I kept my backup. I handed in my resignation to Vel Orath the following morning. He received it with the expression of a man who was not entirely surprised. He asked me if I was certain. I told him I was. He said that I had a promising career in commission documentation, and that it would be a shame to leave over what he called procedural ambiguities. I told him they were not ambiguities. He said that I was young and would learn to see these things in context. I said that I had seen them in context. That was the context. I left. I spent the following weeks in a state that I would not then have described as anger. It was too cold for that, too fixed. Writing up everything I had seen and heard and documented into a formal account, sourced and timestamped, I sent to 7 different offices. The Commission's independent oversight body, 2 interspecies legal advocacy organizations, a press office, a human diplomatic records bureau, and, on the advice of a friend who knew more about how things worked than I did, really to the human delegation's commission representative. I did not hear back for 3 weeks. Then I heard back from everyone at once. What I did not know, and what no one on the commission floor had known, was what Senna Varro had transmitted at the close of the first session day. It was not only the verification record. The human delegation had been, for the previous 2 years, quietly documenting the commission handlings of their submissions across 6 separate proceedings. They had records of tabling notices, issued without the required procedural basis. They had records of withdrawal notations filed by parties other than themselves. They had, in 3 instances, full parallel documentation of session records before and after unofficial amendment. They had compiled this material into a submission that was not a letter and not a brief. It was a record, formatted to commission archival standards, timestamps, seal numbers, and cross-references. It had been transmitted, at the close of Session 1 of the 47th Extraordinary Session, to the Commission's independent oversight body, to 8 interspecies legal bodies, and to every public archive the human delegation could reach. The human delegation had not come to the 47th session, expecting to win the corridor case. They had come to close a record. I learned this from Cale Dern, the aide, who sent Smith a brief message 3 weeks after the session thanking me for my account and noting that it was consistent with their documentation and would be cited accordingly. He wrote in the flat, unhurried register that I had come to associate with the human delegation as a whole. He did not express satisfaction. He did not express relief. He said, "The record is now complete." The independent oversight body opened a formal investigation 8 days later. The investigation ran for 14 months. I was a witness. I submitted my documentation. 7 other current and former commission staff submitted documentation of their own. It turned out, I was not the first junior record keeper to have noticed discrepancies and kept copies, only the first to have left and sent them out. The investigation's final report found systematic procedural irregularities in the handling of non-primary party submissions over an 11-year period, with particular concentration in submissions from the human delegation. It recommended the resignation of 4 senior commission officials, including Soth, the restructuring of the documentation committee, and the reopening of 6 closed cases in which the human delegation's submissions had been tabled or withdrawn without proper process. The report also contained a finding that I have returned to many times. In its assessment of the pattern of irregularities, the oversight body noted that the alterations to session records had been sophisticated enough to evade detection in normal audits, and that the only reason the pattern had come to light at all was that the human delegation had maintained parallel documentation across every proceeding in which the irregularities had occurred. The oversight body noted that this was, and I am quoting from the report here, an unusual and commendable level of archival discipline for a delegation of this size. Commendable, as if they had simply been thorough by happy accident. They had known. They had known for years that their records were being altered, and they had kept the duplicates, and they had said nothing. And they had continued attending sessions and submitting their materials and sitting at the small wall on the left and waiting. They were building a case with the patience of people who understood that a case built too soon is a case that can be answered, and a case built over years, with timestamps and seals and independent transmissions, is a case that cannot. The Veth Corridor case was among the 6 reopened. When it was properly adjudged, the human prior rights claim was found valid. The archive records predated every other survey in the Commission's files by decades. The corridor was awarded to humanity under Commission law. 3 claimant species appealed. The appeal took another 2 years. They lost. I had by then been working for 4 years in a different capacity, a legal documentation practice, smaller scale, less impressive on paper, far easier to sleep through. I followed the appeal through the public record. When the ruling came down, I was sitting at my office desk with a cup of tea that I, for once, remembered to drink. I want to say something about Senna Varro, because I have thought about her a great deal over 30 years and I want to get it right. She knew what was going to happen in that chamber before she walked in. She had the documentation. She had the parallel records. She had transmitted the first copy the night before the session's second day, which means she had already anticipated the amendment. She sat at that small table for 2.5 days, with a satchel full of evidence, and waited for the commission to make a record of exactly what it was doing. She spoke when she was required to speak. She placed one document on the table. She walked out. She did not argue. She did not plead. She did not deliver a recitation of principles or a statement of human dignity or a demand for acknowledgement. She did not raise her voice once in those 3 days, and the few times I watched her face, when she thought no one was paying attention, she had the expression of a person who is concentrating, not a person who is angry. What she gave the commission was the opportunity to stop. She asked for a 48-hour recess. If the record had been reconciled, the 47th session would have closed differently. She offered them that. They didn't take it. And then she walked out, and the document she had placed on the table sat there on the floor table while everyone else cleared the room, and nobody picked it up. And when the cleaning staff came through that evening, they set it with the other unfiled materials, and it sat in the commission's document processing room for 6 days before someone identified it and entered it into the archive, which is how it became a first item in the Oversight Investigation's evidentiary file, stamped and sealed and dated, with a clear chain of custody, unambiguously from the human delegation, unambiguously filed on the session floor. She knew that too. The Veth corridor is a human administrative zone now. I have never been. I understand. It is largely unremarkable. A cluster of systems with useful mineral resources and the ruins of an old structure on a moon that xenoarchaeologists have been excavating for 2 decades. The ruins are not dramatic. They are old and quiet and stubborn, the way old things tend to be. I have been asked occasionally, by people who know I was there, whether I feel vindicated. It is a word that implies the satisfaction was waiting for me specifically, and I am not sure that is accurate. What I felt, when the final ruling came, was something closer to recognition. The sensation of a room coming into focus that had been slightly blurred for a long time. The commission was restructured. Most of the officials involved retired or were reassigned. The procedural code was amended to remove several of the gaps that had been used. New record-keeping protocols were established. The commission continued. It is still functioning, 30 years on, changed in degree but not entirely in kind. The way institutions change when something goes wrong and they survive it. What I think about, more than the ruling or the restructuring or the Veth corridor itself, is the document Senna Varro placed on the floor table and left behind. She carried it in. She put it down. She walked out. The commission spent 3 days managing its record, and when it was done, the only thing on that floor was what she had left there. I have a copy of the document in my files. It is the verification record, the original, with the timestamps intact, showing the 2 confirmed sources, showing the time and the seal of the archivist who confirmed them, showing the record as it stood before the procedural committee convened on the morning of the 2nd day. It is 6 pages. It is dense with technical citation. It is not, in any aesthetic sense, impressive. But I have held it many times over the years, and what I think, when I hold it, is this. They tried to write her out of the record, and she had known they would try. And she had spent 2 years, making sure that when they did, the record of what they had done was already in more places than they could reach. That is the kind of documentation that only happens when you understand what documentation is for. Not for the people in the room, the people who come after. There is one more thing I want to say. 2 years after the investigation concluded, I was asked to provide a formal deposition in a separate commission review. A procedural audit of the documentation committee's practices. In the course of that deposition, I was shown a memo from the period preceding the 47th session, in which a senior commission official had written, in assessment of the human delegation's pattern of detailed submissions, that the delegation's thoroughness reflects the habits of a civilization that has not yet learned which battles are worth the effort. I read it twice. I have thought about it many times since. He meant it as a dismissal. He meant that sophistication, in the world he moved through, involved knowing when to let go, when to accept the outcome and file the paperwork and move forward. He meant that the human delegation's insistence on documentation, on sourcing, on the technical precision of the record, was the behavior of people who didn't yet understand how things worked. He was not wrong that they didn't play by the conventions of his world. He was wrong about what that meant. What he did not understand was that they understood exactly how things worked. They understood that the record was the battlefield. That the battle was not won in the session chamber, in front of the galleries, the speeches and the procedural maneuvers and the careful management of optics. The battle was in the archive, in the timestamp, in the sealed copy in the place the other side couldn't reach. They had been fighting that battle for 2 years before to see 7th session happened. The session itself was almost incidental. The session was where they put the last piece of the documentation down and walked away from the table. When I left the commission, Vel Orith told me I would learn to see things in context. I did. Context is that they built an archive that lasted 30 years and changed the legal status of an entire territory. The context that they did it without raising their voices, without a speech that anyone could quote against them, without a single dramatic gesture that could be reframed as theater. They sat at the small table on the left, the table that was not the primary party's table, and they waited, and they documented, and they transmitted, and then they placed what they had on the floor and walked out, and the room had to reckon with what was left. I am 60 years old. I have spent the second half of my life in documentation work of a different and quieter kind, and I have made my peace with the fact that I left the Commission's service at 26 over something that was resolved eventually, and that the resolution was not my doing. I was a small part of a record that was mostly made before I arrived. But I was in the room. I saw what was on the floor table when everyone else left. I kept the copy. That is what the record is for. The Commission's official log of the 47th Extraordinary Session notes that the human delegation's submission was received, reviewed, and closed as unverified, and that the corridor resolution was ratified by all three primary parties in good standing. It notes this in 4 lines. It does not mention the recess request. It does not mention the document on the floor table. It does not mention the 48-hour offer, or what happened when it was refused. That log is in the archive. My documentation is in the archive. The investigation report is in the archive. The oversight body's findings are in the archive. The appeal ruling is in the archive. The Commission's 4 lines are surrounded, on all sides, by everything they tried to erase. I think Sennavarro knew it would end that way. I think she planned it that way. I think. That is the most precise summary I can give you of how the Joint Treaty Commission came to understand. Green, in the 47th Extraordinary Session of its 11th decade of operation, meant to file a submission against a delegation that had spent 2 years ensuring the record was already everywhere. They wrote her out of it. She had already written it into everything else. The corridor is quiet now. The ruins on the 4th moon are still being excavated, slowly, by people who are in no hurry. The Commission still meets, the archive still runs. And somewhere in the archive's long records, there is a timestamp from the close of Session 1, and a seal, and a transmission log, showing exactly where it went and when. That was the document that mattered. That was always the document that mattered.